Okay, so next up is Stephanie Rainie, who for some reason put me first on her slide, which seems inappropriate.
You're going to have a hard time yourself.
That's true. All right. So at the outset, I also should have said in this round of CLIMAS, we expanded our team. We brought in new sectors of interest, but we also brought in new faculty members, including Stephanie. So Stephanie is assistant professor in School of Public Policy, which is wrong, the School of Public Health, and also a research professor in the Udall Center for Public Policy, and is the deputy director of the Native Nations Institute. Take it away, Steph.
All right, so we propose to do a Southwest Tribal Data Summit, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how Dan and I came to proposing this as an activity related to CLIMAS and climate data. And so generally, when I talk about tribes in the US, I talk about those that are federally recognized, but also those that are state recognized or even unrecognized. And that supports the fact that tribal sovereignty is inherent. It doesn't need recognition all the time. So especially in California and some states in the Southwest, there are tribes who are not recognized by any federal or state entity that operate as a nation and a government regularly. So when we're talking in Arizona and Mexico, there's approximately 44 tribes that we're interested in for this project in the Southwest. And that counts tribes that have lands either who are located in or have lands within those two states. And so what I want to back up and say is when we talk about tribes and climate, some of the evidence that's come forth from some of the more progressive tribes who have dealt with their climate adaptation plans and that kind of stuff, especially Swinomish up in the Northwest, has been that when tribes look at climate information, they're looking at information that relates to human health and well-being, to the environment, and to culture. So they're concerned about the environment and humans as spiritual health and well-being, as well as just environmental data. And they don't readily have access to all of this information. And some of the legacy that resulted in that is comes out in this story here. So in the 90s, there was a hantavirus outbreak on Navajo, and the CDC came in to try to figure out what was going on because people were dying. And they spent about a week walking around in their suits looking like they were on the moon or something, and had no idea what was going on. No idea whatsoever. And somebody from the Indian Health Service, who was an epidemiologist, said, hey, why don't we talk to people here and try to figure out if they know what's going on? And so they started talking to tribal elders who immediately began to say, well, this happened in 1918, 1933, 1934, like all of these years, even back farther in history than that. And said, we know why this happens. We know it happens when there's a lot of rain. We know it's with the mice. And this is what we've done culturally to adapt to this, right? So you don't have mice in the home. It's taboo. And they were able to provide that information, which was a boon to the CDC. But what you also see in that story there is the news article calls it tribal lore. It's not data, it's not information, it hasn't been analyzed, it hasn't been applied, right? And you also see how it was the elders who knew this information. It wasn't the younger people who were working with IHS or with the CDC who necessarily knew that information. So you see a disruption in how information is passed along and stored and analyzed and applied. And so this story marks how data has been basically colonized within indigenous populations in the US, but worldwide as well. And so it's marked by all of those things. And oftentimes what results is you have data that are externally controlled, fully externally controlled and defined by somebody else. And so when you start looking at climate information,
oh, right.
Yeah, this is you.
I'm going to keep the timer here, and I'll keep myself quick. So, sorry for this figure. Many of you who've been around things for a while, I know, sorry, it's familiar to you. So what we're looking at is a figure that my parents made from work we did in the Four Corners over the last, gosh, probably 8 years or so. And the point here really is just to demonstrate that weather and climate data is essentially not available on Indian lands, largely in the US, but demonstrably right here in the four corners. So this figure is simply showing you where weather stations are. The large red polygon is the Navajo Nation. The smaller polygons here within are the Hopi tribes' lands. Together, those two polygons make up 32,000 square miles, which is something like the size of South Carolina. And what Mike's done is, this is a part of an analysis we did. He was just trying to figure out which were reliable stations for climate studies. And essentially what you find is there's one tag. As part of this colonial legacy issue, the stepping stone that we're focusing on now, that's actually federal inholding. That's not native land. So essentially what you have is Native nations who are now doing a climate resilience plan without any access to data, fundamentally, for what they need to do. And this is fundamentally wrong, obviously. But it's also a problem that we see. This is one landscape, but you see it all over the US. I've often noted that you could probably find Indian lands on the US landscape by just looking for weather stations. Wherever they aren't, that's probably an Indian reservation. Good?
Good, excellent. And so that relates to this slide, because what you see there is there's one piece of information that's useful, or one point of information that's useful, and it comes from federal inholding. And so what happened when there was the Gold King mine spill a couple years ago is the federal government came in and said, this is how we view exposure to the stuff. And it was a hiker. That was it. And the tribe and citizens living around there were just kind of like, what? Like, it made no sense within the context. And so some of the work that Dan and I are doing is trying to insert the concepts, sorry, I'm trying to see if my slide has a pretty picture on it, but it doesn't. Trying to insert some new and evolving concepts into climate work. And so broadly, data sovereignty is that data is converted and stored in binary format, so it's digital information, right? And that is subject to the laws of the country which it resides in. So if you use a Google Doc, and you're in Canada, it's under the laws of the US, because that information is stored here in the US. So it's geographically bound digital information. And governance of data refers to how it's owned, collected, controlled, used. It comes from a corporate thinking pattern, and so that's important to recognize as we start to use it within academia and public policy and that kind of stuff. And so over the past 2 years, there's been an increasing assertion to the right of Indigenous nations to control and protect and honor the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. And there's a lot of drawing down to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to find those rights-based arguments for it, as well as federal recognition or state recognition, utilizing those concepts to make this argument. Importantly, this argues for collective and individual rights. So most data is, mostly when we talk about data, we're concerned about your individual privacy and confidentiality. Within this framework, we're looking at collective confidentiality as well as privacy of information for tribes. And the other important thing here is we're kind of blowing out those geographic boundaries. So tribes have rights to information about their nation, so it might be within their reservation or their lands, but also to the communities within those nations or the communities that might be off of those nations. So for instance, Pasco Yaqui has a community here within Tucson, so they have rights to that information. Also to lands that might be ancestral lands that they no longer control, and resources, as well as citizens who may live worldwide. So this really is beginning to challenge the concepts of data sovereignty more generally and broadly. And you see this happening in a number of countries around the world. And so the governance of data, tribes have control at different levels. So they can really control and govern the information about their tribal enrollment or something that occurs on their lands. But they need to be able to influence those data stewards of information about their people and their lands that are elsewhere. And so figuring out how to create that relationship to govern that data is important. And so some of the work that's been done, and I provide this Maori example here, is because In New Zealand, they only have a federal government, they don't have states, but the iwis there, or tribes, have been working together with the federal government to create this overlap of interests in data about Maori. So how do you shift the view that we're creating Maori statistics for Maori people? And the way that they're doing that is by focusing on improving the relevance, and doing that through a number of ways. So they're building information management systems that respond to the needs of the tribes and that are tribally based in how they control their information, because tribal nations have been doing it for eons. And they're thinking about concepts and topics relevant to development from their own viewpoint. And usually that viewpoint is focused on well-being. It's not focused on one specific sector, like health or the environment. And then the way that we're doing this here in the US, so this is from the project that Carlotta Chief and Paloma Beamer have been working on, and through a large collaboration of upwards of almost 20 entities. They've worked with the Navajo Nation around the areas of the Gold King mine spill to identify with the community all the different routes of exposure to the contaminants from the mine spill. So instead of just having this hyper, they came up with about 64, I think, and some of them were physical exposure from drinking the water or using it for cooking, but others were exposures to spiritual health and well-being or the environment itself. So the data summit that we are going to hold here within the next year is going to, we're going to form an advisory board with interested parties from the tribes in the Southwest here and convene to answer the question of what issues do Indigenous nations confront with respect to utilizing data to inform climate resilience activities. And so we want to know about activities and decisions that they're confronting, how they currently use climate data, how they'd like to use climate data, what problems they have accessing data or storing data, and potential solutions for that, as well as opportunities for them to access scientists or other relevant specialists here at the U of A and elsewhere to assist with building their climate information systems. So we see the outcomes from this starting point as potentially being identifying data needs and challenges and opportunities, improving integration of unique issues like Indigenous data sovereignty and the governance of data, and as well as local information and knowledge, and then building partnerships to empower Indigenous communities. And so this summit that we proposed and we're going to have here is linked to two other kind of ongoing projects that Dan and I have. So one of them is last spring we held a cultural uses of water forum here at the U of A, and that is a thread and strand of thought that Dan and I are pursuing around how do tribes or how do scientists approach tribes and work with tribes about solving environmental and other concerns that the tribes might have. And for years we've heard this, integrating Western science with Indigenous knowledge. And so we're trying to push the bounds of that and see within resilience and sustainability science how that's working, how that's not working, and what may be different viewpoints for pursuing the use of different knowledge streams to answer local and community questions. And then the other stream of work that's going on is that nationally, as well as internationally, there's work to produce principles for the governance of Indigenous data to influence states and the federal government, as well as academies, about how to govern and work with Indigenous peoples. And this is focused on climate data. We're going to have a couple of other series around health data and economic data. And then there's going to be another series that's going to be just focused on what are these principles. And emerging principles are basic things like recognizing inherent sovereignty, coming from an Indigenous or community-focused knowledge perspective, and so on and so forth.
Great, thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Pretty cool, huh? Questions for Stephanie? Yes.
Yes.
So is this, how is this idea related to community-based participatory research? Is it kind of from that model or different?
I think it's from that model, I would say, but I think models like that. That's my own perspective. I think we're pushing the bounds of that by saying, you know, CBPR tends to have, especially as the federal government tries to push it down and cut through funding mechanisms, these tentacles of you need a community advisory board, you need to do it, you need to engage in this way, and that doesn't always work, right? There's so many different communities, and part of my perspective on this work is that we're trying to shift the focus to being community focused, and when you do that, there's more of a process than a model, right? Because how you engage with the community is going to change from community to community, and there's bazillions of communities, and so this applies as CBPR does to not only to working with tribes, but to working with any community anywhere in the world. But I think one of the things that this holds consistent with that is has moved forward from CBPR. So there's this movement towards tribally based participatory research versus CBPR, which pushes the ideas that you have to recognize tribal sovereignty and the other unique ways that tribes operate that you won't actually engage with in a mainstream community.
So it's more letting the tribe dictate what the model they want rather than saying, this is our model, why don't we use it?
Yes, and coming in as somebody who can offer guidance and expertise as it's needed, but not driving the questions and the rest to finding answers.
Stay tuned. We're to the total academic pointer. We're in the midst of a review paper that's basically getting at some of these questions to try to differentiate what we're talking about or fit it into that bigger system. Glad you had a question?
Yeah, what kind of representation and participation do you expect from the tribes in Arizona and New Mexico? You said 44 at one point?
There's 44 of them, and so I think we'll likely have maybe a quarter of folks sitting on our advisory board for that. I'm hopeful, depending on how we can leverage the different networks and groups that we work with, and so we have somewhat of a good relationship with the Intertribal Council of Arizona, which is a network of 22 tribes here in Arizona with some overlap with some of the New Mexico tribes. And then I also have a decent relationship with the public groups in New Mexico as well, which covers 19 of them. So
We'll see too. If this, we haven't decided how we're going to exactly execute it, and so it may be that we do an Arizona focus one than the Mexico focus. We just have to pick up the resources.
yes.
And we also just got, Stephanie and I are both part of the project. It's just a fun kind of setup that sort of is related to those, which is partnering with communities in the Arctic and in the Southwest. So we have opportunities to test out stuff here that we can probably take advantage of. Okay, thanks.